On Blue Boar Lane of the streets of Leicester, in the parish of St Margaret, on the 13th of March 1770, a great man was born. This man was Daniel Lambert. He was not born great in fame or figure. His father was keeper of the town jail, and his uncle was gameskeeper to the Earl of Stamford. His great lifelong loves of cockfighting, hunting, breeding, and racing came from memories of time spent with these men. Daniel Lambert was born into a time of great transition for his country, as all times are. At the age of 14, he was placed in the apprenticeship of one Benjamin Patrick of Birmingham to learn the trade of a die sinker. But changing trends had dried up demand for the manufactory's belts and buckles, and that was before it was burnt down in a riot targeting religious dissenters. His apprenticeship was concluded early. Daniel had nothing to show for his time in Birmingham, except for apparently meeting Count Joseph Borowski, a touring dwarf renowned across Europe. So he returned to Leicester to be the assistant gaolkeeper to his father. In the era of the Bloody Code, prisons weren't to hold people long term. Most criminals were dealt with swiftly, come hell or Australia. Jails existed really to hold people before trial, and for debtors. But the jail on Blue Boar Lane was a bridewell. These houses of correction were part of the poor law. They kept vagrants, prostitutes, and any other undesirables off the street, so that they may be reformed with whippings and hard labour. At least they didn't have to pay for their stay. Regular offenders were charged by the jailer for their lodging, for food, and for anything else they wanted. And by Lambert's day, these were held in bridewells as well. It's not hard to see why jailers became known as a cruel and corrupt race. The life of a jailer was certainly not an active one, and Daniel's father quickly retired it to him. It was from this time onwards that his prodigious, famed weight began to increase, prodigiously. In 1793, Daniel Lambert already weighed 448 pounds, but he was no stereotype of the fat and satisfied incarcerator. For one, he remained surprisingly fit and active. An 8-mile journey from Woolwich to London, which had his companions wheezing, he could do without fatigue. He kept up riding and hunting, and it's said he could lift over 550 pounds. And as a jailer, he was by all accounts both very effective and very compassionate. It's said some prisoners greeted the end of their stay with tears while they had to say goodbye to their great jailer. Lambert always helped his charges with whatever they needed before trial, and contemporaries noted that no one must have ever tried to escape. The jailer certainly couldn't have caught them again. Sitting in front of the jail all day, with his pipe and hunting dogs, Lambert became a known figure throughout Leicester. He was an excellent swimmer. He could do so with 2 men atop his back. The local children sought him for teaching. Daniel took them out to the River Soar, where he left them stranded on the other bank, so they'd have no choice but to learn. He also apparently wore the same wet clothes over multiple days. He also fought a bear. One day, his dog attacked a Savoyard dancing bear, so one of the Savoyards removed the bear's muzzle. Lambert stepped in to protect his dog, and knocked the bear down with one blow. When it began to get up, he finished it with a second. Another dancing bear was so cowed by fear that it removed its hat in respect. Over these years, Daniel's weight kept increasing, and so did his national notoriety. People came all the way to Leicester just to see him. In 1804, an article on him was written as part of a series on strange and unique people. That was where the comment on escaping prisoners was written. Lambert refused to have himself weighed, becoming quite self-conscious about his state, so his friends had to trick him into a carriage and drive it over a machine to weigh him. Some friends they seemed to be, but they reported his weight had crossed the threshold of 700 pounds. Daniel Lambert had officially surpassed the Fat Man of Essex to become the heaviest man in English history. In 1805, the jail closed down, but out of no fault from the jailer. In fact, the town magistrates considered his service so satisfactory that they granted him a 50 guinea annuity. The prison was closed as part of a general transition towards workhouses and other forced labour institutions nationwide. 50 guineas a year was all Daniel was left with. He was out of a job, and at his size he couldn't find another. He had become too large for a horse to carry, so he had to give up riding and hunting. Then there were the tourists. Visitors pretended to want to converse on horse breeding, or to invite him to a cockfighting match, things he actually cared about, just so they had an excuse to stare at him. Too large to work, too heavy for his passions, constantly hounded and tricked by gawkers and his friends. He became a near recluse in his house for months. His servant was to send away any who called upon him. But this wasn't sustainable. His friends had long been urging him to exhibit himself, and eventually he gave in. He resolved to go to London and at least get paid for what was happening already. In April 1806, it was advertised in the Times that one could come to number 53 Piccadilly Street to see one Daniel Lambert, a man who weighed upwards of 50 stone, for the price of 1 shilling. Lambert was an immediate sensation. He was squarely in a tradition of people exhibits, or freak shows, which would continue throughout the 19th century. But the Lambert exhibition was a different kind of experience. For one, everyone had to take off their hats when they came in, even Quakers, and when visitors came to see him, Lambert talked to them. He was a very able conversationalist, especially on the topics of hunting and breeding, which most of the upper classes were obsessed with as well. To see Lambert was just like visiting a fashionable parlour with a charismatic host, who just so happened to be the largest man in known history. The difference between this and the exhibition of Sarah Bartman just a few years later in London couldn't be more clear. Sarah was likewise exhibited for her body shape, but being a woman, and most importantly being black, from Cape Colony, in a time of developing racial science, precluded her from the same respect Lambert received. Where he was greeted cordially, she was poked and prodded by her visitors, like an object. Of course, not everyone who came to see Lambert was so convivial, but the fact he was extremely witty helped him a lot with this. For some reason, people were obsessed with his clothes, how big they were, and particularly how much they cost to make. To a woman who asked this, Lambert responded that if she got him a new coat, she'd know the price. To a man who claimed he had a right to know, since his 1 shilling entrance fee contributed to the purchase, Lambert retorted that if he knew which piece of his coat the man's shilling paid for, he'd gladly rip it out. To a young annoyance who asked if he liked dogs, he replied that he liked all, except puppies, and once he simply threatened to toss someone out the window. He always had the perfect response. While in London, he again met Joseph Borowolski, then retired in Durham, who recalled their previous visit some 20 years ago, saying he remembered the head, but not the body. It was a monumentous occasion to the London social scene. Though this brings up an interesting point. What exactly did the people of 1806 Britain think about Lambert's weight? Obesity in the modern world is something really quite stigmatised. It's used as visual shorthand for greed and excess, and somehow also poverty and ignorance. It's seen as a personal moral failing. The Georgians shared a lot of these attitudes. They portrayed the people they hated as monstrously obese, especially if they were actually fat. Much of Lambert's appeal was that he didn't adhere to stereotypes about people his size. He was active, intelligent, he had a strong voice and unrestricted breathing, and he could use the same toilet as everyone else. And his face was apparently quite handsome and unbloated for his body. But they didn't quite have the same stigma we do. In fact, excessive weight could be used to represent many positive concepts, as it has in several cultures over several eras. To understand this, you'll first have to understand some of the context of Daniel Lambert's era. Georgian society was highly literate and highly political. This was most obviously manifested in the satirical print, enormously popular throughout society and disseminated throughout the country. The prints had an established cast of characters. Alongside the gross caricatures of actual politicians, there were fictions used to represent wider concepts. John Bull, the well-dressed and portly man, was the British public personified, and he came to represent all the good in the national character. Plain speaking, honesty, resolve, and most importantly, the hatred of everything foreign. This was all during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, when Britain faced decades of war against French armies and French ideas. For patriotic engravers, John Bull was an enormously useful tool. He offered the public both an example to follow and an example of the folly of abandoning tradition. When Daniel Lambert came to the national spotlight in 1806, this portly, well-mannered obsessee of aristocratic pastimes must have seemed like John Bull come to life, so his image began to appear in prints focusing on his defining characteristic, his weight. First of all, Lambert and Bull's heft was intended to contrast the archetypical Frenchman, who was invariably a thin, raggedy and crazed figure, starved of food and of good government. It's reassuring to see the quality of political discourse hasn't declined too much from the past.
It's over, Frenchman, for you see, I have portrayed you as the weak and thin soup slurper, whilst I am the strong and hefty beef eater.
Lambert's size as a metaphor for the prosperity of Britain is obvious. The fact that even in wartime, the people are rich enough to afford so much food. But it was also used to represent English liberty. Lambert proclaims to Napoleon that his good constitution was nourished by the free air of England. Constitution here is a double entendre, referring both to his body and the political system of England, inherited from the Glorious Revolution, seen as the greatest on earth. The greatness of Lambert was indicative of the greatness of the system, and since Lambert was so great, the system was worth preserving. Using an immensely heavy individual as an embodiment of a wider group's positive characteristic is a practice seen in many cultures, like the Polynesians, and particularly the Massa of northern Cameroon. They have a tradition known as the Guru. For the 2 months where food is scarcest, a few young men live a near hermitic existence, in which they perform as little activity and eat as many calories as they can, all for the sole aim of gaining as much weight as humanly possible. This is done because the Massa find this body shape aesthetically valuable, but also as a visual reassurance of the community's resilience, that even in the hardest of times, they have enough food to feed someone this much. Once they have completed the Guru, the participant exhibits themselves from village to village to be received with great acclaim and sprinklings of flour and milk. Lambert's weight was also just used as a visual representation of the fact he was so big. In pretty much all the contemporary sources which cover Lambert, he's described as a wonder, as a prodigy. He was seen as the biggest man in the world, which meant England was special simply from having produced him. The best print containing Lambert is this one, where he's dressed as a light cavalryman riding a rearing monarch, the largest horse in the world. In a scene much more majestic than Napoleon crossing the Alps, the pair tower over the diminutive emperor, who exclaims, "Parbleu! If this be the specimen of the English leaders, what will Davios be? Oh, by God, I will put off the invasion for another time." Not long before had been the Battle of Trafalgar, where the threat of French invasion had been defeated forever. Lambert had become a real celebrity during his time in London. He met the king. A party from Guernsey came all the way to London just for him. They weren't interested in anything else. One man boasted of having visited Lambert over 20 times. He returned to Leicester much richer than when he had left just a few months before, and he began being seen in public once again, at events like the Leicester races. For the next 3 years, Lambert toured towns across England: Birmingham, Coventry, London, London again, York, Cambridge, Huntingdon, and then Stamford. He seemed once again to be greatly enjoying his life, visiting local races and keeping up with his other hobbies. He must have been a good breeder for the prices he sold his dogs at in London, but he refused to part with one terrier, even for 100 guineas. This dog always slept by his bed. On the morning of June 21st, 1809, while staying in an inn in Stamford, he died suddenly and without any previous signs of ill health. He was 39. The walls of the inn had to be knocked down for his body to be dragged out by 20 men into a 112 square foot coffin, which was buried in the nearby graveyard. His gravestone bears the inscription, "In remembrance of that prodigy of nature, Daniel Lambert, a native of Leicester, who was possessed of an exalted and convivial mind, and in personal greatness had no competitor. He measured 3 feet 1 inch round the leg, 9 feet 4 inches round the body, and weighed 52 stone 11 pounds. He departed this life on the 21st of June, 1809, aged 39 years. As testimony of respect, this stone is erected by his friends in Leicester." After his death, his clothes were preserved like holy relics, and his image was reproduced in inkwells in teapots. A life-sized wax statue made of him back in 1806 had found its way to America, where it was eventually exhibited by the infamous P.T. Barnum. It was eventually destroyed in a fire because it was too heavy to take out of the building. Throughout the rest of the 19th century, the details of Daniel Lambert's life and his association with Napoleonic-era propaganda was mostly forgotten. All people remembered was that he was really, really fat. A platonic ideal of fatness, if you will. Dickens called him the king of fat men in his magazine. His name was dropped in books like The Luck of Barry Lyndon and Nicholas Nicklesby, with the expectation that the audience would get what it represented. The great man historian Thomas Carlyle called Cromwell a gluttonous, spiritual Daniel Lambert. Sociology books described people as Daniel Lamberts of learning. Even after Lambert lost his heaviest man title later that century, Lambert's name still had enough cultural capital for it to be worthwhile for the heaviest woman in Britain to spuriously claim to be his great-granddaughter. But as the 20th century rolled on, even this memory of him faded. Now he's a forgotten figure throughout the English-speaking world. Except, it seems, in Leicester. I certainly had no idea who he was until I visited the Newark House Museum there, where the Daniel Lambert exhibit was described in such a way as if it expected you to already know who he was. So once again, he's a figure of only local renown. I don't think Lambert would be unhappy his name is no longer synonymous with the concept of obesity. At the end of his life, people were only really interested in him as a silhouette, a caricature, not as a person. Here's Daniel Lambert. Don't you know he was 9 feet wide? Well, it's on his tombstone in case you forgot. Here's Daniel Lambert, the spirit and hero of England. Why, he's just like John Bull. He has strength enough to fight a bear. He'd show little Boney the what for. You know, once a Jew and a Frenchman offered him riches if he'd come to Paris. Of course he refused, as any oak-hearted Englishman ought to. And such a witty man. Kind, too. Don't you know his prisoners cried when he let them go? Why, such a thing could surely only happen in England. All we have left of Lambert are a few articles and biographies. His life was made to fit a narrative. The first account of the bear incident has him the one knocked down in a single blow. But that's so much less interesting, isn't it? A supremely kind jailer, a swimming teacher of children, a national hero wouldn't lose to a bear. John Bull wouldn't lose to a bear. But that's really what fascinates me about Daniel. Not that he was John Bull, but that he wasn't. The sources obscure our view, but even through them, we get hints of the real Daniel Lambert. He loved his dog. He was very self-conscious. He had dear memories from childhood. He was fine wearing wet clothes. He was a great conversationalist. He got angry at others. He was compassionate. He liked watching chickens fight to the death. And most of all, he wanted others to treat him with respect, to treat him like a person. Consider all the people who have ever lived. How many of them have left something we remember? We don't really know much about Daniel Lambert, but he left a larger splash than most. And from what we do know, he seems like someone worth a shilling to meet. Not because he weighed 700 pounds, or because he was a hero, but because he seemed to be a genuinely nice person. And that's the kind of greatness worth remembering. Hello everyone, I'm Christian, or Arrow of Time, the creator of this video. If you enjoyed it, I would really appreciate it if you gave it a like, a comment, shared it with someone else, or subscribed. It really took a lot of work to make this. To justify doing something like this again, I need to know that there will be people out there to appreciate it. Thanks.